Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage about the Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live on All 24 News with me, Karim Zachary. Kremlin appointed officials in Russian-occupied southern Ukraine, and they have confirmed plans to annex the region and incorporate it into the Russian Federation. This week's announcement underlines the expansionist agenda that is driving Vladimir Putin's Ukraine war, while highlighting his intention to extinguish Ukrainian independence and redraw the map of Europe. Concerns over international sanctions imposed by the likes of the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, and Switzerland against the growing range of Russian targets centers around a set of key questions. For an in-depth analysis and to answer these questions about the situation on the Russia-Ukraine file, I'm joined live via Skype by Benjamin Barton, Assistant Professor at Nottingham University from Malaysia. And here in studio, I'm in the company of Mr. Hosam Barkan, specialized journalist in All 24 News. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. Let's kick it off with some latest updates. On the 78th day of the Russian military operation in conditions of complete encirclement, the soldiers of the Azov regiment knock out the Russian troops from the positions they had previously captured on the territory of the Azovstal plant. The defenders of Mariupol storm Russian positions despite their constant use of aircraft, naval and cannon artillery, tanks and other weapons. Relatives of Ukrainian fighters of the Azov regiment appealed for help at a press conference in Kiev.
What is happening there is not a war. It is a massacre. It is a violation of all conventions. It is the massacre of people who are surrounded.
Now there are wounded people there. They have no medicines. They die of their own injuries. In normal circumstances, people would get better in 2 or 3 weeks, but in Azovstal they die. Nobody attempted to save them. There is nothing we can do except for gathering at such demonstrations and demanding the authorities to help.
Let me kick it off with you, Mr. Benjamin Barton. Ukrainians claim that they are facing the Russians in Azovstal without them having weaponry supplies, yet they are attacking back. Do you think that these continuous Ukrainian claims about not having the necessary equipments to face the Russian army are true? I mean, what about the huge number of American ammunitions to Ukraine? Do you think these are not sufficient?
It may be that this is simply a strategy to leverage the West into providing more weaponry. It could also be that there is difficulty in supply chains, shipping the armaments through Western Ukraine to the places which need them most. So I think this is also designed in a way to highlight the plight that these particular regions are facing in the Ukraine right now, where they're dealing with a Russian strategy which is to effectively destroy them into submission and get Zelensky and Kiev to either think about the war effort more along the lines of what Russia wants, or to sit down and negotiate and I guess possibly find a way out, which would be I believe to cede some of Ukrainian sovereignty to Moscow. But Zelensky today said that that's out of the question and that's not even up for negotiation. So it looks like the Azov regiment is going to have to stand on its own with whatever support it can get. And I imagine that that's going to be coming at some point or another.
Very nice indeed. And Ukrainian citizens themselves are urging the authorities to evacuate people from Azovstal, saying that it is not a war anymore, but only massacres. Can we verify these claims, about massacres? On the other hand, Ukraine claims that it is attacking back the Russian army. Don't you think that there is some kind of a contradiction in terms of the Ukrainian claims, Mr. Benjamin Barton?
Well, this is war. So obviously, both sides are trying to put forward the depiction of the war that they see, which may be true, which may be exaggerated. Of course, war is not just fought on the battleground, it's also fought in people's minds. Nowadays, it's also fought in social media. I mean, I would believe that those people are facing a massacre, because it seems that the Russian strategy now is to use aerial bombardment, long distance bombardment, in order to get to eviscerate these places. Whereas the Ukrainians have a different fighting style. It's more asymmetrical. And that seems to be working in the type of combats that they're waging against the Russians. But the war is far from over. So, both sides are continuing with these kind of, small victories on one side and a counterattack coming the next day. So I think that there's an element of truth, and there's also an element of falsehood on both sides. And that's simply the result of this being a war which is not simply just being fought on the battleground.
So you agree on the fact that there are, let's say, fake news circulating around. How effective can these fake news, be applied, in the war tactics?
Well, fake news has become a real weapon, because of course it allows both sides to present, as I was, just mentioned, a portrayal of the war which may not necessarily be true on the ground. It's very difficult for outsiders to know what's going on, because none of us are there, right? So we, of course, are dependent on the information flows trickling down from both sides. And of course, the flow of information trickling down is targeted at different audiences. So for instance, the Russians, of course, they're targeting the world audience, but they're also making sure that the information that Russians get about the war is very much, positive from the Russian side. And it's the opposite on the Ukrainian side. So, is this effective? I guess it simply reinforces the biases on both sides about the war. So on the Ukrainian side, which is supported largely by the West, anything which comes on about Russia or against Russia is going to be highlighted. Whereas on the Russian side, it's going to try and point to the Ukrainians as being, exaggerating claims, dehumanizing the Ukrainians as much as possible, so that those who believe the Russian side of the conflict, will agree with the fact that the Ukrainians perhaps have a tendency to exaggerate or make up stories which aren't particularly true. In any case, it's very difficult to verify, given that the war is ongoing. But it seems that the Russians have been committing atrocities. And that there is real proof of that, because procedures have been commenced at the International Court of Criminal Justice, indeed to verify claims of genocide being committed by the Russian army. On the Ukrainian side, it's, I'd say, difficult to verify what's going on because of at least in the Western media, the favorable bias towards the heroic efforts undertaken by the Ukrainians.
Very nice indeed. Thank you for these thorough analysis. I direct my question to you, Mr. Hussein Burkan. Since you've been following this file closely and doing much research about it, what is your own analysis on the situation on the ground? And can we say that Russia has actually lost its tactics here in the war?
Thank you so much, Karim, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
So,
Karim, one of the most important or most difficult challenges that we journalists face in this kind of situations, the war of propaganda. There are two narratives, two stories that we are receiving every single day. And as journalists, we need to analyze both stories and try to come up with the nearest narrative, the narrative nearest to the truth. And currently what's going on in Mariupol, in Azovstal, is basically a black box, and we're receiving outputs, information, and once we analyze them, we cannot really tell what's going on. We cannot really tell if Russia is failing or succeeding, or if Ukraine is failing or succeeding. But one thing is sure is that the arsenal media, the Western arsenal media, is taking the lead. A lot of information that we're receiving are taking the lead. The Western narrative is much more stronger and much more defended than the stories that we're receiving from Russia. So basically, the stories that we're receiving currently is that Russia is saying that opening corridors for people to evacuate civilians and to give the chance to Azovstal battalions to surrender. From the other side, we see that the Azovstal battalions are saying that they are running out of supplies, they are dying, there is a massacre inside the Azovstal work plant. So this is basically what we're receiving right now. There is also one thing that we should shed the light on, Karim, which is that Mariupol's importance for this crisis. Mariupol is at the center of this crisis, and more precisely the Azovstal work plant, because you know that if Russia managed to take control over the Azovstal work plant, it will get a pathway toward Crimea. It's the only land pathway toward Crimea, which is really strategically and tactically important. And you said, did they fail tactically? Until now, they did not reach their goal. Azovstal battalion are defending to the death. Ukraine and the West is supporting them. And until now, both sides are stuck.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Benjamin Barton, do you have anything to say about these analyses that Hossein Barkan just shed light on? And can we shed more light on the tactics of Russia? Can we say that it is really failing, or perhaps the support of the West can actually backfire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point made about Azovstal being the last point between Russia and Crimea is, of course, important, because it seems that, you know, linking to Crimea or taking certain regions in eastern Russia has now become the focal point for the Russian military activity, which is different to perhaps what it was at the beginning of the conflict. So that being said, this is not the first time that I've heard in the scope of this war that, you know, if this defense fails, then Russia's going to penetrate through, and that's going to make a big difference on the war effort. And actually, you know, every time the Ukrainians have been able to dig their heels in, whether that's through their own, you know, strategizing or their own tactics, or whether that's thanks to the support coming from the West and NATO, probably a bit of both. But it seems that, you know, we should never underestimate the ability of the Ukrainians to resist, even when the odds are obviously stacked against them, because thus far the war's been all about that. Now, in terms of the shift of tactics, it seems that more and more the Russians are circling in on very constricted areas, geographic areas within the Ukraine. So before, you know, the war was about basically removing the leadership of the Ukraine and then perhaps controlling the entire country, or at least dividing the country in two. Then there was the gradual retreat from the north, moving east and southwards, or at least focusing on those two elements. But it seems now more and more it's the Russian scope for what they want militarily out of this conflict is, you know, there is a certain element of closure there. Whether that's propaganda or not is difficult for me to say, because, you know, as Hossein Barkan mentioned, it's, you know, we're getting very different stories every day about what's actually going on. But it seems that tactically that is what the Russians are moving towards. So they're going to aim at getting specific areas of land in the Ukraine. And I imagine that it's going to be used as leverage in whatever negotiations are going to then happen with the Ukrainians and, you know, with NATO in the backdrop.
All right, fair enough. Let's move on now to another important point. The foreign ministers of the group of 7 major industrialized countries are holding a meeting in the castle grounds of Weissenhaus, Germany, which will last to Saturday, to discuss the current situation in Ukraine and different ways of supporting it.
It's very important at this time that we keep up the pressure on Vladimir Putin by supplying more weapons to Ukraine, by increasing the sanctions. G7 unity has been vital during this crisis to protect freedom and democracy, and we'll continue to work together to do just that.
Tout cela s'inscrit dans une
All of this is part of a very strong unity of members of the G7 to continue over the long term to support Ukraine's fight for its sovereignty. Until Ukraine's victory, we are not at war against Russia. It's Russia that is at war with Ukraine.
Nous ne sommes pas en guerre contre la Russie. C'est la Russie qui est en guerre contre l'Ukraine.
25 Millionen Tonnen Getreide.
25 million tons of cereals are currently blocked, in particular in the Ukrainian port of Odessa. Cereals used to feed millions of people in the world. African and Middle Eastern countries urgently need it.
Und im Nahen Osten gebraucht werden. Und diese
Let me get back to you, Mr. Benjamin Barton. Do you think that the G7 summit will come out with more practical resolutions that will end the war in Ukraine and stop Russia? There is a growing concern about the impending global food crisis, as we have just followed. Russian Navy ships blocking access to Ukraine's port, which are vital for food supply. EU says it's deliberately targeting Ukraine's food stocks and storages. Can you just tell us what's your take on this?
I mean, in terms of more sanctions, yes, I imagine that the G7 will roll out gradually more and more sanctions. Although the question that comes to my mind is how much of those sanctions actually really going to hurt Russia's economy in terms of the general Russian population. Because for the time being, it seems that there's really been focused on oligarchs. Of course, now there's mention of the EU's energy sanctions on Russia, which I imagine will hurt the Russian economy and treasury quite substantially. I would have thought that from the beginning of the conflict onwards, this has been the reflection amongst NATO and other Western allies such as Japan about how to gradually and incrementally put pressure on Vladimir Putin. And I guess also this is going to depend on what the repercussions are with regards to the Russian economy, how the Russian economy is faring, and how to calibrate those sanctions accordingly. In terms of
perhaps that this is just a continued show about the G7 unity, showing certain collective response, including imposing severe costs for Putin's war, but then nothing of this actually worked. I mean, sanctions were imposed before, and we see that Vladimir Putin is not stopping.
Well, there's debate as to whether sanctions, I mean, I guess it depends what we're looking at here. Are we with the expectations that sanctions were going to bring an end to Putin's reign? I think that's a little bit presumptuous because, if we see sanctions applied across other parts of the world, they don't necessarily bring regime change. In fact, like countries like Iran or Sudan back in the early 2000s, some countries become quite adept at circumnavigating Western sanctions. So I don't think that we should necessarily link sanctions to the end of the regime in Russia, because to be honest, that's going to take a lot more effort. I think for the time being, sanctions is a very, let's say, cost-effective way for the West to continue putting pressure on Russia, whether that's pressure towards some kind of negotiation or pressure towards Russia, deciding to pull out its troops from the Ukraine is yet to be seen. I mean, I would imagine that, as Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, mentioned, that it's all about pressure. And I think gradually the aim is to increase it until, obviously the Russian economy or Russia as a country cannot no longer really bear the brunt of those. Just to come back to the issue of cereal exports, which are crucial given that there's inflation raging across the world, and that this is also partly the cause of this. This is, I guess, one of the two bargaining chips which the Russians still have. Well, three being, of course, the human casualties from the war. But I mean, with the rest of the international community, one is energy, the other one is, the export of agricultural goods. As mentioned, the impact of, countries on the African continent, in the Middle East, is a way of trying to leverage that. But I think that, it would seem that if you compare the regime of sanctions, how that can progress, the potential of the West decoupling itself from Russian energy supplies versus what the Russians can threaten the West with, it seems that at face value, Russia's future is not looking particularly bright. So it's going to, I think, take a lot for the regime in Russia indeed to find mechanisms for survival. Not saying that it's impossible, but it's going to be incredibly tough. And that naturally will, have repercussions on the war effort itself over time.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Hussam Barkan? What can the West possibly do more in order to stop Russia? Obviously, the sanctions are going to take a long time in order to take effect.
Exactly. So, Karim, that in nowadays, in the era that we're living right now, the economies of the world are all connected to each other. And when we talk about sanctions, so far, there were a lot of sanctions, but there will always be the boomerang effect. So before the West impose any kind of sanctions on Russia, they will think twice before doing it, because most of the time they're going to be affected, maybe sometimes even before Russia. And we've seen the results of the previous sanctions on the West, starting with sanctions on energy, sanctions on from the United States and England on oil imports and other sanctions. So the question is what kind of sanctions they can impose, more sanctions they can impose in order to hurt Russia. You know, they say that Russia is a gas station with a nuclear arsenal. So if they want really to hurt Russia, they need to sanction their energy. And they cannot do this because they're going to be the first to be affected. And they're talking about this. Can you imagine that putting sanctions on Russian energy means stopping Russia from financing this invasion? But the thing is, they cannot do this because they're going to be the first one to be affected.
Very nice indeed. Now, let's move on to a different important development. Finland's leaders said Thursday they're in favor of rapidly applying for NATO membership, paving the way for a historic expansion of the alliance that could deal a serious blow to Russia as its military struggles with its war in Ukraine.
For us, joining NATO would be not against anybody. We would like to maximize our security in way or another while thinking membership in NATO. But it is not a zero-sum game. If Finland increases its security, it's not away from anybody else.
Let me get back to you, Mr. Benjamin Barton. If Finland's application for NATO plays out as expected, this country of under 6 million people will have redrawn the European security map in a way that was previously inconceivable. Will this have tremendous consequences for Russia indeed? And what are these consequences?
Well, if you follow the Russian narrative on the war in Ukraine, then obviously one would expect that it would have some kind of consequence, because obviously one of the main gripes which Russia had with Ukraine was, on the one hand, the prospective membership towards NATO as etched into the constitution, on the other hand, the prospect of joining the European Union, but both of which, to be honest, seemed relatively far off before the start of the conflict, and now actually, ironically, have been accelerated, or at least in terms of EU membership, it would seem. As for Finland, well, it's not entirely a surprise that those countries which, perhaps had been hesitating about NATO membership for a few decades, whether for historical reasons related to their neutrality or for fear of what message that might send out to their Russian neighbors, now suddenly are getting cold feet, effectively, as to what could happen to them if Russia was to launch an invasion.
Exactly, which leads to the second question. How is Russia going to respond to this new NATO membership, knowing that previously Russia did warn against this and other Nordic countries join in?
Well, it's a bit of a game of chicken and egg, to be honest. I think, if Finland joins NATO and then Russia launches an attack, then that's an attack on a NATO member state, and that would, activate Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And therefore, there would be war between NATO and Russia, which is something that Russia, up until now, has chosen not to do. Let's not forget, at the beginning of the conflict, there was lots of speculation about Russia penetrating into the space of NATO and EU member states, such as Poland, the Baltic states, Slovakia, and Hungary, which share borders with the Ukraine. That's not happened. So obviously, it puts Russia in a bit of a bind in terms of its own narrative, perhaps more towards the regime in Russia, and that the message, communicated to the Russian people themselves, that if Finland was to join and Russia was to do nothing, then that would leave, in a way, Putin a bit toothless, and that would be considered, again, an additional defeat for Russia, on top of, the fact that the war effort hasn't gone exactly to plan. But you also, can understand that from the Finnish side and also from the Swedish side, there's always that unknown. If we do nothing, then there's a risk of us being attacked, and we're not a member state. We're not yet a NATO member state. But if we do join, maybe that will trigger, a Russian response. This being said, if it does, then Article 5 would be invoked, and then Russia would have to contend not just with Finland, of course, but the rest of NATO. And I mean, let's face it, NATO has also been sharpening its game a little bit for the past few months, recognizing some of its strategic shortcomings and accelerating a move to shore up its own defense.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Hossein Burkan? Is this provocative act really going to lead us into war? Is Russia going to execute its warnings?
Yeah, as just Benjamin said, it's really a dilemma. And because Russia at the beginning used the pretext that it is invading or it is starting the special military operation in Ukraine in order to stop it from joining NATO or the European Union. And currently we're seeing Finland and other Scandinavian countries trying to join NATO. I think these countries are just putting pressure on Ukraine. And before the start of the special military operation, there are a lot of studies that show that 25% of the population Finland population wants to join NATO, only 25%. But after the start of the special military operation, we can see that 70% of the population want to join. But when the officials have been asked if they're gonna use a referendum and give the chance to the people to choose to join NATO or not, they said no. It is, they use different kind of pretexts. So we can see that they are just putting pressure. They are hesitating because otherwise they would have just give a referendum to the people to decide such a crucial and a very important and sensitive decision. So I don't think that Finland is going to join, even though it's like the perfect opportunity for them to join. I think that it's going to just escalate the situation, and I think that it's going to lead to more of a direct war between the West and Russia, which is something that is not good to both sides, if not only both sides, but to the whole world, because we really don't want to see. But it seems like there is certain parties perhaps who are taking interest of this war lingering on. There could be a resolution to this, don't you think? Can you just repeat the question, Karim? Because
I said, perhaps there are certain parties benefiting from this war lingering on. I mean, it's been dragging on now for 3 months.
Yeah, of course, there are a lot of parties who are actually taking a lot of interest from this war, especially arm industries. There are a lot of experts and a lot of think tanks that talking about the special military operation in Ukraine, and the amount of money they are making currently is just phenomenal. Of course, Karim, but if we talk about like the world. The world currently is suffering. All countries are suffering right now because all the countries all over the world are all interconnected economically, politically, and these people who are making profits from selling weapons. I mean, it's so egoist, so selfish. And I don't think that, even though they're making a lot of money and making a lot of interest, I don't think they're gonna risk going to a direct war, nuclear war between the two most important nuclear power in the world, because it's going to mean the end of the world. So I think it's just putting pressure on Russia in order to show how, to destroy the myth of the strong Russia, to destroy the myth of the Russia that can play an international role. They just want to isolate Russia and show how great and how strong the West is.
So we're heading into a unilateral world, like a unipolar world, you're saying?
Currently, what Russia, what China, what a lot of countries want is a multipolar system. Because after the end of the Cold War, the United States was the only one taking decisions, unilateral decisions. We can see that the from the winners of the Second World War, only 5 countries have the veto right, and we can see that they are taking decisions unilaterally. So I think that a multipolar system is emerging right now. We can see the manifestation of this in different places all over the world. We can see it between Russia and Ukraine, and we can see it between China and Taiwan also. I think that a multipolar system is emerging, and these are just embodiment and manifestation of this.
Let me share with you this last info here and give you a final word along with our distinguished guest, Benjamin Barton. The Russian gas giant Gazprom has announced that it will stop using a gas pipeline belonging to Europol Gas, which operates the Polish part of the Yamal-Europe gas pipeline, for the transit of gas to Europe via Poland, in response to Western sanctions imposed on Russia because of the offensive in Ukraine. Germany, on the other hand, stated that Russia is using gas supply as a weapon against it.
Overall, it has to be said, the situation is getting worse to the point that announcements of the use of gas and oil as weapons are now coming to fruition in different places.
Mr. Benjamin Barton, since we're run out of time, can you give us briefly a word about this development?
Well, this is tit for tat, you know. Obviously, you can't talk about sanctioning Russia on what is effectively its largest export and what fills the treasury coffers and not expect some kind of retaliation. But to be honest, I think that the European mindset towards this is one geared to expecting, I think in the short term, to have to pay a certain price. And sadly, it will be the consumer which will pay. Perhaps governments will chip in here and there to steady the flow. But I think this is part of a process which should have happened a long, long time ago. Let's face it. In the EU, there's been talk of diversifying away, not just from Russia, but diversifying away from imports of oil and gas, which the European continent is dependent on. So, this is the time or never to start. It's just that it's not going to be easy, it's going to be costly, and it's difficult to predict with certainty how that's going to work out.
Thank you so much, Mr. Benjamin Barton. Thank you, Houssam Burkan, for being with us here in studio. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. That's the end for now. Bye.